Welcome to everyone, and thank you for coming out to view the wonderful documentary film with us. I'm Robert George. I have the honor to be the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions here at Princeton University, and we're delighted to be associated with the film and with my dear, dear old friend, Rick Brookhiser. This is not the first documentary that Rick has been involved in. It's not the first that we've aired at Princeton. They're all good, indeed, great, and Rick, I want to congratulate you on the film and to say how delighted we are to be associated with you in this way.
Well, thank you. And can everybody hear? Are these mics working? Okay. I want to thank Gary Griffin, our director of photography, Barbara Ballo, our editor, John Paulson, who was the director who brought the film home after the lamentable death of Leo Eaton, who helped conceive and produce so much of it. And thank you, Robbie, for having us here.
It's our pleasure. I also want to thank and introduce one of our nation's premier religious liberty scholars, Professor Mark Movsesian of the St. John's School of Law. John is a great specialist in this area. He's a graduate of Harvard College, summa cum laude, Harvard Law School, magna cum laude. He's one of these super high achievers, and I think it's great for the nation that he's decided to dedicate his talents and energies to helping us to understand the law of religious liberty. Mark, welcome.
Thank you very much, Robbie. I want to say I was also a Madison Program fellow. That's another thing I want to put on my resume, which was great a few years ago. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you. I do want to make one correction to something Alan said. I wish I could claim to have been an architect of this film, but I am not. So I'm just a commentator and, like you, a member of the audience. But thank you very much for having me.
Welcome. Well, what a rich feast that was. And I have to say, and thank you all for featuring the Beckett Fund so prominently, and so many members of the Beckett Fund staff and board in the film. I myself am a longstanding member of the Beckett Fund board and executive committee, and Beckett is proud to be associated with so many great victories for religious liberty in the Supreme Court of the United States. There's so much in the film to talk about, but I was struck at one point toward the end with the following thought about our religious pluralism and what our religious liberty has produced over the course of our 2+ centuries. The film noted that Louis Brandeis became the first Jewish appointee to the Supreme Court of the United States. From that point forward, for many years, it was understood that there was a Jewish seat on the court. When Brandeis left, Benjamin Cardozo was appointed. After Cardozo, it was Felix Frankfurter.
Isn't pluralism great?
After Frankfurter, it was Goldberg, Justice Goldberg. And at the same time, Mark will know this, it was understood that there was a Catholic seat on the court. Frank Murphy, followed by William J. Brennan, and so forth. It was also understood that there was a Southern seat on the court. Hugo Black occupied that for a while. And with the appointment of Thurgood Marshall, it became understood there was a black seat on the court. But let's just focus on those two minorities. And the film brought out very clearly, those two religious minorities, the Jewish minority and the Catholic minority. The film brought out very clear the persecution that these two religious groups suffered. But how remarkable, in view of that by the 2000s, there was a point for many years when the Supreme Court consisted of 3 Jews and 6 baptized Catholics, not a single Protestant on the court. Now we have a Protestant on the court again. It is Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, who happens to be, of course, an African American. If that's not progress born of pluralism and respect for religious freedom, I don't know what is. What a remarkable thing that is when you think about it. So people who say that things haven't gotten much better over the years in the United States when it comes to prejudice and bigotry, I think have got some splaining to do about the makeup of the Supreme Court and what that tells us. Did you ever notice that?
Oh, sure. And I was thinking as I saw the film, and I haven't even looked at part of it for a long time. So, I mean, I was obviously intensely looking at many parts, but this is the first time I've seen almost the whole film. We cut out the Mormon episode. We had to cut something because after a 2-hour film, you can't have a discussion. So that left. And in a way, one of the things we miss with that is the worst religious persecution in this country. And I was very struck when we did our interviews in Salt Lake City with Dallin Oaks, who's one of the apostles of the LDS, Latter-day Saints, and other prominent Mormons. They could all of them would say in passing, oh, my great-grandfather was arrested, or my great-grandmother died of typhus on the way to Utah in Nebraska. These were people who were so badly persecuted they had to leave the United States. After Joseph Smith was lynched and his brother was lynched, they said, we got to get out of here. We got to go to Mexico. Now, then the Mexican War happened, and where they were going became the United States again. But it was Utah, so it was in the middle of nowhere, and they were secure for a while. So there's this, I was feeling the tug in the film of on the one hand, George Washington and James Madison, and those immortal principles. And then they get tested because, in the founding era, what was it? Catholics were 2% of this country. I actually think that's a little high. I think they were a little less than that. Jews were like 0.1%. But then in the 19th century, you have millions of both coming here for various reasons, poverty, persecution, whatever, coming in from Europe. And then, then there's always this, oh my God, look at these people. And then this recovery, well, yeah, look at these people. What's your problem with these people? And that has prevailed time after time. And we are lucky that has occurred. We're blessed that has occurred. We've, as Pasteur said, luck comes to the prepared mind. And we made preparations in our founding principles so that was possible and even likely to happen. Fortunately, it has.
Mark, some of that discrimination and some of the violence and persecution that Rick is referring to there was just sheer brute thuggery. There's no question about that. But, respectable people, honorable people, held some of those same prejudices, or at least concerns about those waves of immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe, much of it Jewish and even more Catholic. How was it that respectable people could hold those views, and what were they really concerned about?
So I think I can actually put together both of your insights here in answering that question. As you were talking about the Catholic seat, the Jewish seat, isn't it great how America has changed? And I think it is great how America has changed. But I think we also have to understand that those religions also changed. So let's take the LDS example, which sadly was cut out of tonight's, of this afternoon's presentation. So the LDS Church was really out of step with some major parts of American culture, including marriage. The LDS Church, the cases that they were discussed actually in the excerpt, Reynolds and Davis, these are cases in which people were testing anti-bigamy laws. And the argument was, look, we are in the LDS Church. For us, plural marriage is a religious obligation. We have to do this. And the court simply dismissed that and said, absolutely not. Religious freedom does not extend to polygamy. That's ridiculous. In fact, one of the cases, the court even says this isn't even a religion, which of course can't be true, right? Of course, the LDS Church is a religion, but the court said, no, it's not really. We don't think of this. But over time, the LDS Church changed. And so now the LDS Church, for the moment, does not have polygamy as a religious obligation. There was a revelation that came in 1890 that allowed Utah to become a state. So if we look back and we say how benighted our forebears were, well, there were real differences here. And America changed and became more religiously pluralistic and more tolerant. That's a great thing. But I think sociologically speaking, we have to understand that those points of tension, at those points of tension, these religions also changed. And so you see these two kind of things coming together. And that's why, so we shouldn't necessarily congratulate ourselves on how wonderfully open-minded we are as a culture, because the tensions also were reduced over time.
That is
There's
such
a,
go
there's
ahead,
a
Rick,
wonderful anecdote. I talked about this with Cardinal Dolan when we were interviewing him. I asked him if it was true that in 1928, when Al Smith ran for president, he was the first Catholic candidate to run for president. And of course, he loses to Herbert Hoover, and anti-Catholicism was an issue in that. And he was taxed with these 19th century encyclicals, which
condemn democracy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Condemn
Yeah.
religious freedom specifically.
right. And so he is supposed to have said, "Will someone tell me what the hell an encyclical is?" And I asked Cardinal Dolan, "Is that true? Did he really say that?" And Dolan said, "Yes, he did." Now, it's funny, but I think what Smith was really saying was, "Will someone tell me what the hell an encyclical that violates American principles could be?" You know, Smith is saying, I'm born in this country. I grew up here. I love it. I'm an American. I don't believe anything that's contrary to this. Why are you hawking me with all this, 100-year-old stuff that Pius IX did?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The anecdote I like about Al Smith it's sad that on election night, when the returns came in, he sent a one-word telegram to Rome, to the Pope. It simply said, "Unpack." But Mark's point about the way the religions were changed, I think, is a terribly important one. Some of the concerns of the respectable people, I don't think these concerns were warranted. I'm not trying to credit them, but it wasn't crazy, right? They weren't bigots. They weren't thugs. Some of the concerns were, look, Catholicism is a faith that does not have a democratic church polity. Judaism, too, doesn't have a democratic polity. It's not hierarchical in the way that Catholicism is, but much authority is on the charismatic authority of particular rabbis. And of course, in the Catholic Church, there's a hierarchy. So I think the concern of many Protestant Americans was that these churches don't form people with democratic sensibilities and sentiments so that they can be good democratic citizens. Now, of course, at the end of the day, I think what disproved that thesis was the valor and heroism of Jewish and Catholic men on the battlefields in America's wars, where they proved themselves every bit as patriotic, every bit as good democratic citizens as anyone else. But you're right about the changes to the religion. Catholicism is a really good example. So, by 1965, the Catholic Church, which in the 19th century had condemned something called religious liberty. What they meant by that is an interesting question we could get into. The same Catholic Church that in the 19th century condemned religious liberty issues a document in the Second Vatican Council called Dignitatis Humanae, which is a resounding, robust, no holds barred, no equivocations endorsement of religious liberty. It becomes a force for religious liberty throughout the world. The story behind the story is that was the influence, in very large measure, of an American Jesuit named John Courtney Murray, who was able to explain to the still at that point largely European leaders of a church, the Catholic Church, that religious liberty in America did not mean what religious liberty meant in a Europe shaped by the French Revolution and its anti-religious and anti-Catholic sentiments. There was another thing that we were on about in the United States. European church leaders tended to run those things together. So they assumed by religious liberty you mean religious indifferentism or religious relativism. No religion's true, or no religion's false, or religion is irrelevant, or religious vows don't bind, or that we would be better off secularizing. Religion's a bad thing. Well, none of that was part of the understanding of what religious liberty was in America. And Murray was able to take that American conception of religious liberty and present it to Rome. And it profoundly influenced the Catholic Church. It's precisely the point that Mark was making. On the Mormon point, Rick, I find it fascinating that the Republican platform of 1856, the very first Republican platform, gave the explanation for why we needed a new party, the Republican Party. and it was to fight the twin relics of barbarism, a moral crusade against the twin relics of barbarism, slavery and polygamy.
Right, yesterday's issues.
Oh, okay. Yep.
Let me just say why I started on this project. I had written a book called "Give Me Liberty," and it was 13 episodes in American history, and the second one was the Flushing Remonstrance. And so, in talking with Thomas Lehrman, who I should also thank, he's the executive producer of this, and he's the only begetter. In other words, he paid for it, and very committed to it, and a very active executive producer.
Member of the advisory council of the James Madison Program, I'm proud to say.
Yes, and also was very active in the Beckett Fund for many years. But so we talked about this and decided to see how we could push that story further. You know, the Flushing Remonstrance is a great moment, but let's follow this through American history. And the film you just saw is finally, after years, the result. But the reason I was so taken with that, and still am, even with all the other stuff that we filmed and discovered, is that on that occasion, it wasn't wise leaders. It wasn't James Madison or Abraham Lincoln. These were ordinary people. And they weren't sticking up for themselves. They weren't like, you know, Catholics saying, let us use our Bible in your schools. They weren't blacks saying, let us have our own churches. They were sticking up for other people. And then the third thing is, they weren't doing it for demographic reasons. It's nice to have immigration in a diverse country. Or they weren't philosophes saying that this is, you know, the rights of man. They were saying, our Savior saith, this is the law and the prophets. They were sticking up for religious liberty for religious reasons. And then they put their names to that piece of paper, and I still seeing those 6 guys who could not sign their names. They just made a little mark, and then the clerk had to say who they were. But they laid down a marker, and I remain so impressed by that moment. And then they had to back off because Peter Stuyvesant arrested them all. You know,
Yeah,
all right, you're going to do this. And what could they do? The only place they could appeal to is on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. That's where Stuyvesant's bosses are. But he's it. You know, they're in this little godforsaken place on the backside of this continent here, and it's like them versus the man. And then the man, like, okay, fine, you're all going to go to jail. It was a very loaded moment, and I hope we did it justice in this film.
We did indeed. One of the moments for me that was interesting about the film was right when you were telling, of course, the dreadful story of General Grant's issuing of General Order number 11. I couldn't help but reflect that while Grant was issuing that order, the Secretary of State of the Confederacy was Judah P. Benjamin, a distinguished Jewish lawyer and statesman. Would have made him third in line to the presidency of the Confederacy. We did not get a Jewish Secretary of State of the United States or any Jewish official as high as Secretary of State for more than 100 years later, until Henry Kissinger was made Secretary of State in 1973. It's a remarkable fact.
I think Benjamin had converted, hadn't he, or been baptized? No. There was another senator, Yulee, from Florida, who
I think that's probably right.
I think he converted. Right.
Can I ask just a trivial question? So I was trying to read the Flushing I'm from Queens, actually, so so I was really interested in this. Was that written in English? Were they writing that in English or in Dutch? It looked like almost.
Well, yeah, it's Dutch, but it's also older forms of handwriting.
Right.
You know, so yeah, when I saw it, I was like trying to recognize words or phrases, and it's tough.
Mark, I don't think that my friend, the wonderful constitutional law professor Akhil Amar of Yale, absolutely brilliant scholar, I don't think he did justice to the Federalists' case against the Bill of Rights. He almost made it sound as if they were opposed to rights. I think you should share with the audience a little bit about why people like Hamilton and Madison and the Federalists at the time, the people who supported the Constitution, opposed the Bill of Rights. It was not because they were against liberty.
No, I mean, it was because they thought the federal government has no control over these things anyway. And if we start enumerating rights, that will suggest the federal government has these powers. And by the way, we may leave some things out. And so from the Federalist perspective, not only was the Bill of Rights unnecessary, it was dangerous.
Yes, exactly right. So as Hamilton put it, if you understand the structure of the Constitution as protecting rights by limiting powers, by checking powers, by making sure no one has unlimited or unchecked or unaccountable powers, then the Constitution itself, even without the Bill of Rights, is for all intents and purposes, I'm quoting him, a Bill of Rights. And as Mark said, the danger is if you start to enumerate them, you weaken the structural protections. The people, and more importantly, those in office, those in power, come to believe that the government can do anything it wants to do so long as it doesn't come up against a prohibition in the form of a stated or enumerated right. And when we get the Bill of Rights, in order to try to deal with that problem, they add the 9th and 10th Amendments. The 9th indicating that the enumeration of certain rights in this Constitution shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. And then the 10th, making clear that any powers not delegated to the federal government or prohibited to the states are reserved to the states respectively and the people. They're trying to undo the damage that they knew adding a Bill of Rights would do. To the cause of what? Liberty.
I will give Akil credit, though, for saying what I think was maybe the most important thing in the whole movie when he said that the real defense of religious liberty is in the hearts and minds of the American people.
Amen.
You know, he said, Constitution, it's great to have it. Laws, those are fine. Congress and the court weigh in. But if the people stop caring, that's all just paper.
He's absolutely right. And of course, here he is restating what the authors of the Federalist Papers say when, in speaking of the Constitution and its protections of rights and its limitations of power, they say these constitutional structures are auxiliary precautions. Auxiliary means secondary. So if these constitutional structures are secondary ways that we protect liberty, what's the primary way? It's virtue in the people. The responsibility of the people to protect their own liberties. The constitutional structures, the limitations on power, the protections of rights, those are necessary, but they're not sufficient and they're not even primary. They're auxiliary.
And if I can say, Robbie, and they also would have said, and that virtue of which you're speaking comes from religion. They
Adam
would
said
not
it
have,
expressly.
they would not have conceived that you could have a virtuous citizenry without. Hamilton said it too in Washington's farewell address, which Hamilton wrote, which is we shouldn't indulge I can't remember the exact words, but we should be careful about indulging this idea that we can have virtue without religion. And of course, without virtue, you can't have a constitutional structure.
What I found interesting about that, always found interesting about that statement, was that he says it might be possible in an especially refined mind. I'll treat you like my students. Who does he have in mind when he's saying that? Jefferson. Exactly. Although Jefferson himself, I think, is wrongly depicted as an enemy of religion. Now, clearly, he is opposed to what he calls monkish ignorance and so forth and so on. But
well, you got to love Thomas Jefferson. He goes, as president, one of his little tasks that he takes on is he goes through the Gospels and he decides what are the authentic sayings of Jesus and what are the non-authentic ones. And he said, it just took me a couple of days, and he's there with a razor cutting them out. And it's like, scholars are like sweating over this and arguing and debating, but Jefferson, bless his heart, he just like does this. And they used to give, maybe they still do, they used to give Jefferson's Bible to incoming members of Congress. I don't know if
That's interesting.
if that custom.
I mean, essentially, his technique was he cut out the miraculous stuff and left in the moral teaching. That was really largely what he did. But
Also,
this very
also
same
makes you think,
Jefferson-
by the way, that presidents didn't have that much to do, that they could just really sit around and do this.
This very same Jefferson, who, of course, as any undergraduate will tell you, it might be the only thing they know about Jefferson in many cases, but they'll tell you, this very Jefferson, who was a slaveholder, in speaking of slavery, said, Rick, you could quote him as well as I can, "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that his justice will not sleep forever." It's almost as if he's anticipating Lincoln's second inaugural address, where Lincoln says that the Civil War and all the dreadful, unspeakable, unimaginable carnage of the Civil War is a punishment brought on both the North and South for the what? The sin of slavery.
And remarkable for Jefferson to use such language. I mean, he doesn't typically or ever elsewhere talk in such biblical language.
And it does make clear that Jefferson, though he did own slaves, did not think that slavery could be morally justified. He thought it was wrong. He couldn't find the way to manumit his slaves. He couldn't even do what Washington did. Washington manumitted his slaves in his will and made financial provision for them because he knew that they would need that. You'd be really throwing them to the dogs if you simply manumitted them with no financial support. But Jefferson lived a high life. He was constantly in debt. He died in debt. The Library of Congress, I think, bought his books, right?
Right, and even that didn't do the trick.
Yeah. And so he found himself, from his own perspective, stuck for financial reasons with his slaves. He couldn't manumit them, even in his will. And that, of course, is what causes us today to think of him, whatever virtues he has, and they were many, also as hypocritical. He knew slavery was wrong. He trembled for his country when he reflected that God was just, precisely on the issue of slavery. Mark, other points about the film that occurred to you?
Yeah, there are a couple of points, actually. One of them is a sociological point. One of them is a legal point. I'm not a sociologist, but I guess I'll take the opportunity to say, and that is, as I was watching the film, I was struck again and again about how the groups that sought religious liberty were I think the word is troublemakers is the word that's used. These were the troublemakers. They were the outsiders. And I think it's fair to say that they were the people who were challenging convention, challenging religious tradition, challenging social tradition. They are the ones who are responsible for, Jehovah's Witnesses, the LDS Church, Catholics, even Quakers, especially in the beginning. Baptists. But now that's not the case. Now, actually, it seems more and more the groups that are raising religious liberty concerns are the religious traditionalists, are the people who are trying to hold to convention. Well, and I wonder what we make of that. I mean, if you talk to Patrick Deneen, he would say, well, that was liberalism from the beginning. This was I'm not saying I agree with that. But it seems to me incontrovertible that is the case.
Well, now I think you've touched the third rail.
Right.
So the documentary tells the story. Rick, you do a great job of telling the story of the reaction in the nation, the unified negative reaction in the nation to the decision in Oregon against Smith, the Indian peyote case, resulting in an uprising to enact legislation in Congress known as the Religious Freedom Restoration Act to overturn, for all intents and purposes, it's complicated, but for all intents and purposes, to overturn the Smith decision and put back into place the regime of law that existed under the Yoder decision. That's the decision pertaining to the Amish and their right to exempt their children from high school. It was a remarkable thing, and the nation's rarely been so unified. When Smith was handed down, opinion by Justice Scalia, when Smith was handed down, the ACLU joined with the moral majority. People for the American Way joined with the Christian Coalition. Everybody agreed that the decision was a nightmare and a disaster and an injustice. Richard John Newhouse, the late great Catholic priest and scholar Richard John Newhouse, declared that the Supreme Court has read the Free Exercise Clause out of the First Amendment. Well, overwhelmingly, I think in the House it was a voice vote, I think, and in the Senate it was
Like 93-7 or something.
93.
Like
Yeah,
that.
they, unbelievable.
97-3. Something
We I think it was 97-3 actually. Rarely do we get such unity. But if that vote were today, it would be completely different. That old coalition that once seemed so tight has completely blown apart. And now we're divided ideologically on the question of religious exemptions for free exercise purposes. Mark, what the heck happened?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what time is it? I don't know what happened, but I think I can describe, I don't know why it happened, but I can describe it as part of the polarization which seems to be taking place around the country on many, many issues. You know, I mean, you said ideological, Robbie, it's also partisan, right? Unfortunately, religious freedom has become a partisan issue. And by the way, one of the great things about this film is it shows it shouldn't be a partisan issue. And historically, the left has benefited as much as the right has benefited from religious freedom. And we should always remember that kind of thing. But look, it's about polarization. It's about the middle dropping out of many parts of American life. And unfortunately, religious freedom is like that too. There's kind of no middle around it anymore.
And so the exemption cases today divide the nation because they concern things like whether a baker can decline to bake a cake specifically for using his artistic talents specifically for a same-sex ceremony. Now, it's not a question of whether people who are in a same-sex relationship can be told to leave because we won't sell them some cookies. The question is, can he be required to bake a cake specifically for the occasion? And those on the left and in the Democratic Party, by and large, say he has to comply. He can't be given an exemption. And those on the right and in the Republican Party take the opposite view.
Right. And that second point, I'm sorry, that second point I wanted to make is that the second issue I got from this was something that Alan said at the very beginning. He was quoting George Washington, and he said, in America, we believe in religious freedom. There's no persecution. We give no assistance to bigotry. All we ask is that everyone demean himself like a good citizen, something like that. And this is precisely what we don't agree upon anymore.
Yeah.
Are you demeaning yourself as a good citizen when you say, I'm not making you the cake?
Well, but, you know, don't despair. I mean, it's been worse. You saw those very striking pictures of Klan rallies in the 1920s on the streets of Washington, D.C. And these aren't a bunch of people in a southern field burning a cross. This was broad daylight, hundreds of people marching through the streets of Washington. In 1924, the Democratic Party convention lasted 103 ballots because it was a fight between the pro-Klan faction and the anti-Klan faction. You know, and I'm not saying that the Democratic Party is wedded to the Klan, obviously not. But there are moments when these forces or tides of opinion well up, and you know, you just got to live with it. You got to deal with it, and there's no perpetual motion machine, right? I mean, it's our responsibility every lifetime to deal with these questions and stand up for what is right, because there are always challenges and there are always puzzlements, and sometimes even good people will go astray, and there are also lots of bad people always. So you just got to work at it.
Amen, brother. In addition to that startling, appalling photograph of those Klansmen marching in Washington, D.C., there was the photograph of the Klansmen in their full regalia in what I take was the Oregon state legislature.
Yeah, something like that,
with the
like
legislators,
the bill signing or something,
standing behind them. And of course, what you were telling there was the story of the attempt to undo Catholic education, make religious education, private religious education impossible. Why? Because the Klansmen and the Protestant majority in Oregon, the Klansmen were not considered outsiders here, decided that if we're going to make these immigrant Catholic and Jewish kids good Americans, we're going to have to Americanize them in the public schools. And Americanizing them meant for these people de-Catholicizing and de-Judaizing them, turning them into good democratic American citizens. And it was only the intervention of the Supreme Court in the case of Pierce against Society of Sisters, and then in the case of Meyer against Nebraska, which followed it up, that undid that. Otherwise, it probably would have swept through the nation, which was Protestant majority, I think, in every state at that point, would have swept through the nation, and the Catholic school system that grew up would never have happened.
Although, as the film said, the sisters were joined in their lawsuit by Episcopalian groups, Jewish groups, many religious groups saw their own interests as well as principles at risk here. So it wasn't just a Catholic pushback.
No, it wasn't just Catholic pushback. They did have the support of these other religious interests, but they lost in the legislatures. That was the problem. There were however much support they had from religious figures themselves, they did not have the broad public support they needed to prevail in the legislature.
But federalism, okay, they lost in Oregon, but there were 47 other states at that time. So, there would have been other fights even had the Supreme Court not, said what it said.
Right, there would have been other fights, but my guess is that what began in Oregon would have spread, and the intervention of the court, I think, prevented it from spreading and made it possible for the parochial school system to develop, which, you brought this out very well as well, Rick. Why did you end up with the parochial school system in the first place? It's rather unusual. Catholic churches throughout the world, there's really nothing quite like the American Catholic parochial school system. It was precisely in response to this idea that, well, we're going to have these Catholics, if we're going to have these immigrants, we're going to have to Americanize them. And the public schools are going to be the mechanism for Americanizing them. What's interesting to me today is, in some ways, you have exactly the same fight, but now it's not Protestantism against Catholicism. It's a different kind of dynamic. It's a kind of secularism against religious folks, because mainly of disagreements about moral questions. And as my emeritus colleague Robert Withnow pointed out now more than 2 decades ago, the politically salient differences these days are no longer between religious denominations, Protestants or Catholics or Jews. They cut across them so that conservative, especially morally conservative Catholics have more in common politically with Orthodox Jews and evangelical Protestants than they do with their liberal Catholic co-religionists, and same for Jews and same for Protestants. I'm told, John, that we can't, so we just have another couple of minutes for the conversation. Rick, was there anything else about the movie that you wanted to call people's attention to?
Well, we were very grateful for the cooperation of almost every religious group that we dealt with. There was one that was unfriendly. I won't say which it was. I don't want to cast any aspersions, but all the others, opened their doors. You could tell from the films. There's Apostle Dallin Oaks, and there's Cardinal Dolan. The funniest thing he said when I interviewed him, we couldn't put it in the film. It's not relevant, but he said when he first appeared as Archbishop of New York, the first question he got from the press was, "You're the 11th Archbishop of New York, and you're the 11th Irish American. How did that happen?" And he said, "Pope's infallible."
Apostle Dallin Oaks of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, popularly known as the Mormons, is probably the Mormon who, so far, has come closest to appointment to the Supreme Court of the United States. We still haven't had a Mormon, so that's yet to come. Dallin Oaks was a very eminent professor of law at the University of Chicago Law School, and then served on the Supreme Court of the state of Utah. And his passion, his area of law about which he's passionate, is religious liberty for obvious historical, and in his case, as the case of so many other Mormons, familial reasons. We have had some very distinguished Mormon judges at the federal level, most recently Judge Griffith, Tom Griffith of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. But I suspect that the next big religious breakthrough at the court will be the appointment of a Mormon Supreme Court justice.
Was there anything in the film that surprised you?
No, I can't say that. There were things that made me think, that startled me, like my thought when you were talking about General Order Number 11. Gosh, well, while the Union is doing this, the Confederacy has a Jewish Secretary of State. So there were the startling things that I'd never put together before, but nothing really startling about the film. I think the great achievement of the film is to give us this panoramic view of the history of American pluralism, the history of religious liberty, and the way in which our pluralism and our religious liberty has produced what we have today. Mark,
Well, and also it tells people's stories. It shows that religious liberty is not simply an abstract idea that lawyers talk about or philosophers talk about. These are real people and real communities. And I think by personalizing it, it makes it much more compelling to people. I thought it was a great film. One thing I would say is I thought about the future of religion here. And this is an issue the film doesn't address. There's no reason it should have. But nowadays there are so many people, maybe 25%, 30% of American people who say they are nuns. Now, they're not atheists. They just have their own idiosyncratic religions. And they don't belong to organized religion. And so I think you may see now going forward, the challenge for the court is going to be, well, are the nuns a religion? Do people who say, I have an idiosyncratic spiritual belief and I don't want to wear a mask, and there have been cases like this in the COVID epidemic, is that religious exercise? That's something we haven't had to address too much until now, but I think we will.
You know, at one point, Rick, in the film, you talk about the nation becoming more secular. And now Mark has really raised an interesting question about that. Are we really becoming more secular in the way Europeans have become secular? Or is it just that the religious sensibilities of a lot of Americans are changing? But it's not really captured quite by the term secular.
Right. They're not all becoming Diderot.
Yeah, no, that's certainly right. Yeah,
they're
or
becoming
taking the view that religion or spirituality doesn't matter.
right. They're becoming like upstate New York and the burned over district, where you had someone, Joseph Smith, someone has a vision. I mean, and he created a huge church, but he wasn't alone. There were lots of people who thought, well, all right, here's my take on it. And so maybe what you're saying is that's what's happening.
Yeah, what Rick has me what Mark has me thinking about is a European secularist is not going to say, well, I'm spiritual but not religious. Right. But that's exactly what the nuns say.
Absolutely.
The nuns, Nones, not Nun. Yep. What the nuns say is, I'm spiritual but not religious.
Right. I reject organized religion. I don't reject spirituality.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, of course, that I think is part of a larger trend where Americans are rejecting, we've lost trust in as a people, our institutions. And that's not just religion, although it is religion. We've lost trust in religious institutions. We lost trust in the media, lost trust in academic institutions. Yep. Have you seen the ratings, especially after the Harvard hearings? Have you seen the approval ratings of American higher education institutions? They're pretty bad. Of course, Congress has had bad ratings for lack of trust for a very long time. Even institutions that used to rate pretty high, like courts and the military, trust has faded in those institutions as well. So religion here, far from being an outlier, is really in line with other institutions in the society in which people no longer have trust. And when people no longer have trust, they start trying to home make what the institutions ordinarily would or historically would have provided.
Well, and that impulse is where many religions began.
True enough.
George Fox, the first Quaker,
Quaker.
he had an experience on a hill in England, and he thought, well, I can't be alone with this. This is something that everybody could and should have. So now, Will Rogers did say, I belong to no organized political party. I'm a Democrat.
Yeah.
So maybe I belong to no organized religion. I'm a Catholic.
Yeah, maybe that could be. Well, thank you again, Rick, and thanks to the team that put this together, and of course, thanks to our friend Tom Lehrman. Mark, thank you for joining us.
Thank you,
for this
Robbie.
panel, and thanks to all of you for coming out. We're always delighted to have members of the community as well as our students and faculty at Madison Program events, and I hope we'll see you at the next one.
Thank you.